This question also is for both of you. You know, risk committees, banks of a certain size are required to have a risk committee. Other companies may have that dispersed amongst, you know, other various committees. It speaks somewhat to, you know, the governance and how all these various risks may be addressed. But I would say that the recent banking failures has brought up, there was a great article today in the Wall Street Journal about this, and it was really about the impact of social media. But I was particularly struck by a few comments in the article and about the risk of the unknown, and that the hardest risks to hedge are the ones that boards can't and management can't envision. And there's a difference between ignoring risks and getting blindsided, which we all know SVB did both. So if you have a risk committee or you have the responsibilities for risk dispersed among various committees, what would you say are some of the best practices in terms of governance for boards in how to address these risks, and particularly now with speed becoming a new factor that no one anticipated, and there being so many other factors that we have to think about and try to envision in the future?
I think that if you look at what happened with Silicon Valley, there's always a tendency in all companies to sort of fight the last war. And in banking in particular, the last war is generally credit risk. If you look at the history of banking, the one thing that is above everything else in terms of problems is credit risk. So banks spend a lot of time focusing on credit risk. And this may be true of other industries where you focus on what has been the problem in the past. There hasn't really been a liquidity risk in banking in a long time. And what we found was, of course, an enormous liquidity risk at a speed that we've never seen before. So yeah, it to some extent was unimaginable that it could happen in that way. In hindsight, it's pretty easy to see that all the ingredients were there for it to happen. But it's always hard to imagine, you know, what hasn't happened in a long time. I think one thing that I've seen as a way of, in terms of corporate governance, is that annually management is asked to, you know, what are the top 10 risks that you face? Maybe it's competitors that are too large or too erratic. Maybe it's supply chain. Maybe it's employee retention. Maybe it's fraud. There could be a whole bunch of it. But the point is, put them down on a piece of paper. What are the 10 biggest risks? And then associate with that, what are the metrics that we should look at to judge the degree of risk in that situation? Some are hard to measure, but generally speaking, you can find some way to put down some kind of measurement. And then you can, between that annual period of listing the 10, you can look at a dashboard that says, where are we on all those risks right now? And I think that's a good practice that keeps people in tune with the fact that there are risks and that we should recognize them.
You know, Francis, you used the phrase fear of the unknown. And, you know, when you sit on a board, that's really it, isn't it? That's why you buy D&O insurance, is because of the fear of the unknown. And there are so many areas that can come from. Today, we're talking about financial risk management. The other things that come to mind for me are ESG things that are changing in our world. Cybersecurity is a big deal. So when you talk about best practices, I think what we're hearing more about is a lot more diligence around boards of having the right people making up any particular board, very tailored to that industry. What's good for a tech company may be very different from what's good for a bank, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a big evolution as well.
In both your experience, and Mark, this may be more specific to you, but do you think that most directors really understand how to, you talked about various categories of risk and actually cataloging those and developing a dashboard so that directors could understand what those risk profiles are and what the company's risk appetite is and what their risk tolerance levels are. But you can look at each of those verticals, if you will, and understand what that appetite is in each of those verticals, but taken as a whole and with all of the external factors, again, the risk of the unknown. Do you think that we're looking at all of those risks holistically and how they may come together and have an impact on a company in a way that individually and our individual appetites for that risk may not? I'm asking, that's not a rhetorical question, but
Yeah.
do you think that directors are really being able to look at that? Because management is in charge of risk. Directors are just in an oversight capacity. That's why I'm asking.
I think it's hard to do. I think it's hard to put everything together. I think you're right in separating the role of management versus the board. The board is there to ask questions and make sure that management is paying attention to risks and how those risks can come together. When you have the list of the top 10 risks, the number one question is, are they correlated? Are they going to happen at the same time? And is one likely to cause the other? So those are legitimate questions to ask. And I think but our role really is ask questions and make sure that people are thinking about various things. And that's the whole role. I don't think you can put yourself in management's position of having to enumerate all those risks and even to fully understand all those risks the way somebody that's been running a company for a long time can understand it. But the role of asking questions, I think, is the most important thing that board members can do.
Yeah,
And
I think, Francis, you think about, the fiduciary duty that directors have, the duty of care and diligence. And it's important that, as D&O underwriters look at this, they want to see boards that are involved. They want to see boards that ask questions, to Mark's point, that are on top of evolving issues, that have experience in those particular issues. And then they want to see companies that respond and respond quickly to those questions.
And Chris, do you, when you're talking to boards around the issue of D&O insurance, do you have questions around risk culture and risk appetite? Are those things that, for D&O insurance purposes, are those important questions for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the whole goal is to put our clients in the best light possible from a risk culture standpoint. So asking really detailed questions around, financial risk management in some of the areas that I talked about earlier that D&O underwriters are asking about. I mentioned privacy and security. Lots of questions around where companies are taking their privacy and security evolution. ESG is particularly important for most companies, but some companies maybe like in the energy space, a lot of questions around that. So understanding that whole big risk culture is a big part of positioning our clients to get the best results in their D&O coverage.
Touch briefly on governance, but I'd like to dig into that a little more deeply. Just as I read more and more about these bank failures, it appears to me that there were a number of failures from a governance standpoint, and I could look at them really almost categorically across all bounds, where we look at, NOMGA, compensation, we look at audit, we look at all of the traditional governance aspects of a board. And I also break it down into the way I often look at things when I look at companies in my day-to-day life, which is typically, people, process, and priorities. Using those as some thoughts, I'd love to hear your perspective about the governance failures from your slice of the world that you see in these bank failures, and how those takeaways could be applicable to any company.
I think one thing you have in common, and I think this does relate to other industries as well, is a CEO who is highly regarded and has a reputation, strong reputation, and there may be a tendency in that case to say, well, if it's okay with him, it's okay with me. And I think that is something that can lead to laziness on the part of a board, and can lead to, especially if it's, I don't know how these boards were run. Some are run in sort of autocratic manners where questions aren't encouraged. And the general attitude is, you're here to rubber stamp what I tell you. That's a dangerous situation, no matter how revered the leader is. And I think I just get back to my mantra that you have to be on a board that is open to questions, that's willing to entertain questions, and you have to have directors who are willing to ask those questions. And if you don't have that, then you don't have good board supervision.
Yeah, I think about, from where I sit, material events that impacted the D&O world. If you think back to the .com bubble, or you think about Enron or WorldCom, or the mortgage crisis, or last year's crypto meltdown, or now, the bank failures, a couple of things. One, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. That sounds trite, but that had a lot to do with some of those failures. And then exactly what Mark's talking about. In all of those situations, you have boards that either didn't see or govern what was going on, or the management team didn't listen to them.
I might add just a couple of things, just from my perspective as both a director and someone that kind of looks at these types of things on a daily basis. I would say, to some extent, just based on what I've read, I certainly was not sitting on the inside of any of these banks, but from a nom-gov perspective, did they have the right people and the right talent on the risk committee? From what I've read, probably the answer to that is no, because they had very few people on that committee that had any risk experience. From a compensation committee, who's to say? But the ultimate question is, are the comp structures structured to provide the right incentives? And only time will tell about that. And then again, obviously, audit. Should audit have taken a look at this, and given the fact that some of the issues were hiding in plain sight? And again, the risk committee, which we've already discussed extensively. But I do think that all of those things, particularly in companies where risk oversight tends to be distributed amongst a variety of committees, we do really need to think about that. And certainly with ESG, with some companies, they fall under audit. Some, such as the board that I sit on, we do have a risk committee because it is a bank, but we do have other parts of, the E is now under the risk committee, but we have the S and the G under other committees. But we do have a report out, a comprehensive report out twice a year to the full board to ensure that we're looking at all of those factors and that the full board is engaged in those discussions. So it really is important. The governance piece of some of these things is a very important aspect of this.